let's pick up the story of the Billington Asylum where my first video ended, with the will of its proprietor, James Chew. In April 1769, 8 months after the death of Dr. Chew, the will and testament was proved by his executors, his 22-year-old eldest son Abraham, his daughter Alice Chew, apparently unmarried, and one Joseph Chippendale of Manchester, who does not at this point seem to be a relation. Legally speaking, at 22, Abraham was an adult and presumably was also free to live life as he so wished, although with 6 younger siblings, at least one unmarried elder sister, and an instruction in his late father's will to share £900 equally between them. It's probably reasonable to guess that he felt the full weight of the responsibility that was on his shoulders, the same as the head of any 18th century family. 6 months later, on the 22nd of October 1769, Abraham Chew married Jane Parker. She was 7 years his senior, and the wedding took place at St Andrew's Church in Slaidburn. Only 8 miles from Billington, it was far enough away that it was actually considered to be in Yorkshire. And socially speaking, the young surgeon had made a pretty good match. If we step forward almost a decade in time, to the 16th of April 1779, we find a reference to Abraham in the will of his father-in-law, Robert Parker, a gentleman living at Dunner, which I think is probably Dunno, in the parish of Slaidburn. And the document tells us much about Abraham's in-laws. It seems that Jane Parker, Abraham's wife, had 2 brothers. John's address was not stated, but Robert lived at Henthorne near Clitheroe. There was also, or had been at least, a deceased sister named Millicent, who, confusingly being a Parker by birth, had also married a man called George Parker, and she had left 4 living children before dying a month before her father made his will. Abraham's mother-in-law, Anne, was apparently alive in April 1779, but Robert Parker, her husband, had given some thought to what was going to happen to the household goods after her death. Robert Parker intended that Abraham should inherit 1/3 of his furniture and his silver plate, also 1/3 of whatever money was raised through the sale of the household goods. Now today, the obvious question that we would ask there, I think, is why didn't Robert Parker just leave something to his daughter Jane? Because she's his blood relative. Why leave it to Jane's husband Abraham? And I think the simple answer is because, legally speaking, whatever Jane inherited at that point in history would have automatically become Abraham's anyway, because he was her husband. By now, Abraham and Jane Chew had made a home for themselves in Billington, and 5 children had been baptised at St Leonard's Church in Lango. It was a perfectly logical choice. It was the church where Abraham and his own siblings had been baptised. It was where his father had been buried. It was also a very convenient distance from the asylum where he worked. And in fact, their youngest daughter Alice was christened in August 1779, 4 months after her grandfather Robert Parker made his will, 9 months before he actually died in May of 1780. Quite a good place to consider the Parker family tree and what it might have looked like. From a genealogical point of view, Robert Parker's will is fairly interesting, but if we're looking at it for trying to find out more about the history of the asylum at Billington, it really isn't all that much use at all. It does mention Abraham Chew, his son-in-law, but at no point does Robert Parker actually say anything at all about where he lived or worked. So to learn more about Abraham's career, we're going to have to look in other places. Between 1780 and 1811, the burial registers for St Leonard's Church in Lango identify 33 people as having been patients at Dr. Chew's establishment. 22 of them died between August 1780 and July 1800. 9 of them were women, 13 of them men. And before Rose's Act of 1812, standardised parish registers didn't exist. So recording ages when people died was at the discretion of the individual vicar or parish clerk. Some did, and at Lango they elected not to bother. But they did tell us something quite interesting about the occupants of Dr. Chew's asylum. All were described really very bluntly as insane, without any further details or any description of their symptoms, which means it's absolutely impossible to say whether this assessment was accurate or not. There are no clues about their social status, if they were from a more respectable family, shall we say. Maybe they had been sent to Billington for a bit of anonymity while the family pretended that they'd gone away somewhere for their health. It doesn't even tell us whether they were married, single, widowed, whether they had any children, whether any of them were children or younger people themselves. We don't know whether they lived locally, whether they'd been transported to Billington from elsewhere, perhaps at the recommendation of another doctor. But what we do know, strangely enough, is their names. Perhaps there's something else that we should consider here. By the year 1780, Abraham Chew was 33 years old. He was married. He is in fact a father of 6 children. He'd been in charge of the Billington Asylum since his father's death 12 years earlier. So how did he run the facility? Was his establishment a way to make money from the people that fervently hoped that he could cure their relatives with psychological problems? Or was he running the hospital because he and his father before him had genuinely cared and they hoped that they could improve people's mental well-being? Strangely enough, there is a little bit of documentary evidence about this. On the 8th of November 1780, Abraham received a visit from a doctor and 2 justices of the peace. who came to assess the asylum. They'd actually come round to have a look and make an inspection. And what's even more interesting is that they even left a brief report. And you can still read this report for yourself if you go to the Lancashire Archives in Preston and look up the reference on the microfilm. There are several of them for various different years. Let's have a look at what they said in November 1780. On an inspection made this day in the house of Mr. Abraham Chew for the reception of lunatics at Billington in the county of Lancaster by Robinson Shuttleworth and James Worley, Esquires, 2 of His Majesty's Justices of the Peace, and Dr. John Hayes, Doctor of Physic, so he's a medical doctor. No improper objects were found, or anything deserving of censure. The patients seemed to be healed with great humanity, and in a manner suitable to their unfortunate circumstances. It looks as though conditions were a little better than you might expect compared to what you might think of when you first hear the phrase 18th century lunatic asylum. It looks like not only did the inspectors care that the patients were being looked after and as comfortable as they possibly could be, but it also looks as though Abraham Chew was conscientious enough to try to run his establishment in a humane and caring fashion, which makes me like him a little bit more, I think. In 1787, Abraham Chew turned 40, the same age as I am now. When I'm not working, which is an incredibly rare occurrence these days, I'm quite often found watching TV or probably spending more time than I should on the internet, or maybe if I have got a bit of quiet time, I may possibly be reading a book. But Abraham Chew did not have the internet. He didn't have electricity or an overflowing email inbox. He didn't have a mobile phone that needs charging just when you want to go out. So what did he actually do when he was off duty? Between January of 1787 and September of 1799, Abraham's name is printed in the Manchester Mercury at least 6 times because he acquired something called a game certificate. Now when I say game certificate, when I'm talking about game, I am not saying that he needed a licence to play chess. Thanks to the Game Acts of 1784 and 1785, any individual who wanted to go out and shoot game was compelled to buy a certificate from their local justices of the peace. You had to pay the princely sum of 2 guineas, or in today's terms, £485 or so. Although by 1792 the price had risen a bit to 3 guineas. Inflation is not a new thing. If Abraham Chew was able to swear the equivalent of £485 a year, just in case he fancies the odd pheasant, partridge, rabbit or something similar for dinner, what that's telling me is that he had quite a lot of spare cash. I wonder how much people were actually charged to lodge their relatives at his asylum. He may also have some quite luxurious taste in food, which we're going to come back to a little later. The taste for fine food would most certainly help to explain the last chapter of his story. The autumn of 1795 must have been a good season for Abraham and his wife Jane. On the 29th of September, Michaelmas, the Chester Courant, the newspaper, announced to the world that their eldest son James had been awarded the degree of Doctor of Medicine by the University of Edinburgh, so James is following in father and grandfather's footsteps. Exactly 6 weeks later, their eldest daughter Anne married the Reverend William Barton, the new vicar of Lango, at St Mary's Church in Blackburn. So as Abraham and Jane approach middle age, things aren't really looking promising for their family. And by June of 1800, Abraham was 52 years old. By today's standards, he's not even close to retirement age. Some people would say he's barely entered middle age. But it seems that at 52, the manager of the Billington Asylum was now very conscious of his own mortality. 52 in 1800 was not the same as 52 in 2025. On the 26th of June, 1800, Abraham made his own will. It was clearly time to hand over the family business to a new generation. If my said son James shall be minded to continue the dwelling house wherein I now reside for the reception of lunatics, it is my desire that all the household goods, furniture and effect in or about such dwelling house, necessary and proper for carrying on such business, shall be appraised and valued by 2 disinterested persons, that he, my said son, shall be at liberty to take them at such valuation, but if he refuses to take them at whatever the assessors say they're worth, then my desire is that my said son Abraham, the other son, shall have the like proposal made to him upon complying with the terms herein before specified. So we've got 2 contenders. Who is going to continue Abraham's work? Will it be James? Or will it be Abraham Jr.? Something must have happened over the next 24 hours, because on the 27th of June, the following day, Abraham Sr. adds a codicil to his original will. Something had gone on overnight. Instead of either of my said sons having the option of carrying on the said business, the same shall wholly devolve upon my dear wife Jane Chew and my 2 daughters Jane and Alice, to whom I commit the care and management of all my patients. I request them to pay the same attention to such patients as has hitherto been shown to them. But here's the thing. They were at least requested to call in the aid and assistance of either of my said sons or other such medical person, as my said wife and daughters shall seem meet, that is, meet meaning appropriate, in cases of doubt or difficulty. So why the sudden change? I think it may be relevant that within the previous month, Abraham's sons, Abraham and James, had both married in Blackburn. They're still in their late 20s at this point. As young medically qualified doctors, perhaps they want to try their chances in the medical field in the more urban setting of Blackburn. Perhaps their mother and sisters were not ready to be sidelined just yet. Perhaps Jane Chew liked being involved. Perhaps Abraham Sr. slept on the decision and realised that managing the asylum actually required a feminine touch. Giving his sons the options to provide the ad hoc medical advice while the ladies took care of the day-to-day running may have suited everybody a lot better. Talking of Jane, Abraham's wife, she was certainly not forgotten in his will. She was in line for rather a nice annuity, because her son James and son-in-law the Reverend Barton were instructed to invest £1,000 and to give Jane the interest in 2 equal payments every 6 months. Now I think the interest rates at that time were round about 4 to 5.5%, so she would be looking at 40 to 60-ish pounds. That sounds like quite a good sum to be living off. Any other money that Abraham might have would be divided up between Abraham Jr., Jane and Alice. But if all of this has led us to think that Abraham's world centred around the asylum at Billington, the will has got one or two more surprises in store. He actually had some kind of property called a Stony Bank in Easington, which is near Sladeburne, so it's actually nearer where he got married. He had messuages and farms. A messuage is a piece of land with a dwelling house on it in Sladeburne, Newton, Billington, and surprisingly even Goosnar, which is a long, long way north. It's not even close to Billington. So I wonder whether he would be buying those or inheriting them from somewhere. Perhaps the Goosnar hints at a family connection in the north part of the county that hasn't come to light yet. Sometimes these wills do create as many questions as they actually answer. We don't know exactly when Abraham Chew died, but it was relatively quickly after adding that codicil. 8 days later, in fact, on the 5th of July 1800, he was buried at St Leonard's in Lango. And what is particularly strange about that date is that it was exactly 32 years after his father's funeral. The parish registers at the time were in the habit of recording the cause of death now and again. Abraham had died from irregular gout. Now normally, gout is caused by a build-up of uric acid, and the acid then forms crystals which gather around your joints, often your big toe, causing understandable acute pain, inflammation, swelling around the joints and the tendons. It can be worsened by overconsumption of meat and alcohol. Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, was certainly believed to have suffered from gout. But that's regular gout. Irregular gout is a little bit different. Here, the symptoms affect not the joint, but the stomach and the kidneys, even the nervous system. Untreated, I understand that it can increase the chance of heart disease and cardiovascular problems. And for some reason I cannot help but remember that line in Sense and Sensibility when Mrs. Jennings asks Eleanor to take the broken-hearted Marianne a glass of Constantia wine, her reasoning being that when the late Mr. Jennings had a touch of his old colicky gout, he said it did him more good than anything else in the world. Now colic is associated with the stomach. Did Mr. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility have irregular gout? Because it certainly doesn't sound like it would be normal to get colic in your joints. Maybe Abraham Chew was working on the same principles. Perhaps his game certificates had been the means of quite literally putting too much fine food on the table, washed down with more than the odd glass of wine. Shortly after Abraham's death, an announcement was placed in the newspapers. July the 16th, 1800. The public are respectfully informed that the Lunatic Asylum in Billington, near Blackburn, conducted by the late Dr. Chew, is still continued open for the reception of lunatics. The patients will in future be under the care of James Chew, Doctor of Physic. See, they're trying to reassure people there with the detail that James is medically qualified, I think. and also Abraham Chew, surgeon, the sons of the late Dr. Chew, assisted by Mrs. Chew and daughters. This is certainly a family concern, who had a considerable share in the management and direction of the house in the lifetime of the late Dr. Chew. So it looks as though a third generation is ready to take over. The scene is set for the next part of the Chew family story, which I will be exploring in a future video.